Very, very warm welcome to this event on practical resilience with my great friend, Dr. Chris Johnstone. Chris, it's really, really great to have you with us this evening.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
And Chris, it's a pleasure as always to see the amazing number of people who've already tuned in to join us. Thank you so much for being here, everybody, and for all these lovely messages we're already seeing on the chat from wherever you are all over the world. It's great to have such an active community with Action for Happiness, and thank you to everyone who does so much to support our movement, whether that's taking part in our online courses, joining our groups and things which have moved online in the COVID crisis as we've been unable to meet face to face in the way that we would love to. And of course, all of the thousands who join these regular webinars. And I couldn't think of a better guest or indeed a more important topic for us to be sharing this evening. So in a moment, Chris and I will begin a conversation together. He's got some great ideas, really practical ideas to share with us on resilience. We're then going to have a few interactive things that we can sort of put into practice ourselves. And of course, as always, we'll leave time for your questions. So if you'd like to use the Q&A function in Zoom, please feel free to leave questions for Chris. I'm sure he'll be really happy to address at least some of them. We may not have time for all of them. And as you are already, folks, please do feel free to use the chat. If it's a bit bombarding for you, feel free to minimize it. But otherwise, we love to see your comments. We love to see your responses. And we'll even be asking you to share, if you'd like to, some responses on resilience during this evening's session. So we'll run for about an hour in total, and looking forward to getting lots of engagement as we go along. But Chris, there's so much I want to ask you about resilience. It's such a topical topic, but I wondered if we might start with a bit about you and your background. You've obviously had a fascinating range of work and real, both personal and professional experience of this idea of resilience. Could you tell us a bit about your story and why this matters to you?
So it began for me, I think it's a really useful question for any of us who are interested in resilience, is to trace our resilience story. When do we start getting interested in it? And for me, I can identify a few key points along the way. And one of those was in the early 1980s when I did my first degree, combined medicine and psychology. And I was doing a research project looking at the impact of self-help strategies, psychological self-help strategies for pain control. I get people to slow down their heart rate using biofeedback and then see what effect that had when they plunge their arm into a bucket of ice cold water. And what that taught me was that our experience of distress is influenced by the state that we're in. When we're calmer, when we're able to use some strategies to relax, people could put up with higher levels of distress. And so when I qualified as a medical doctor working on the wards in hospitals, I'd use these techniques to help people to get themselves in a calmer state before, for example, I took blood samples and things like that. But what also happened for me, another point along the way, was when I was working as a junior hospital doctor, I was working the most extraordinary hours. I had a contract to be available for work for an average of 88 hours a week. So
Wow.
some weeks it was much more. Um, and I was reduced to an exhausted wreck. And one of the things about severe nervous exhaustion is often experienced as depression. And I became severely depressed. And we organised a workshop for junior doctors, myself and a few friends. It was a resilience workshop, really looking at what was going to help us. And this was in the late 1980s. And we called it Coping Without Sleep, because with such long hours, our sleep was really disrupted. And we came to the conclusion that the self-help strategies can help a bit, but by themselves, they're not enough. And that's why really in looking at resilience, it's helpful and I think important to see resilience as something that happens in layers. It's not just in individuals. You also need to look at the team and organizational and societal dimensions of resilience as well. And so what we did coming out of that workshop is that we got very involved in the campaign to improve our working conditions, which there's something else there. Resilience isn't just putting up with awfulness. It's about when you have a difficult beginning, finding a better way that it can go. And so in that campaign, I actually took my health authority to court and ended up on the front page of newspapers and on the television news. And over 6 years and about 10 court hearings, we eventually won the case. And I was actually paid a small damages settlement for the injury, so, the work related injury of getting so depressed.
Mm.
So anyway, I actually reached a point where, being so exhausted, I fell asleep driving. I closed my eyes for like one of those like little micro moments of they call it micro sleep. And when I opened my eyes, I was on the wrong side of the road with a car coming towards me, and veering to avoid a collision, I crashed into a rock. And it's really interesting, that expression, hitting rock bottom, because that for me was a rock bottom. I was so depressed at that time. You know, it was really the kind of nightmare period of my life. But also, crisis can be a turning point, and that was the point where I thought, this job, it wasn't just uncomfortable or unpleasant, it was also a threat to my life. And I ended up resigning and having a whole period of time outside of medicine. And in that time, I was still struggling with depression, and I I searched out training and transformative experiences to help me recover. I got very interested in mental health recovery, and that, you know, looking back on it, I went through an awful time, but actually there's this lovely expression, post-traumatic growth. It's through my deep dips in that time, I see it as part of my training for doing the work that I've been doing, really pretty much ever since, really, which is as a resilience trainer. And then I went back into medicine and I worked in mental health for many years, teaching resilience skills, particularly with people with addiction problems, where crisis is a common trigger for relapse. And so my work was being alongside people, looking at other ways of dealing with crisis than drink or drug use. And I was so struck by how useful this was that I got really interested in education. Really, I worked in adult education and got very involved in workplace education, looking at resilience in the workplace too.
Chris,
So
it's really powerful to hear the personal story and to see how much it shaped your own life, but also, as everyone listening can already tell, you've got such a lot of professional knowledge now about this as well. I wonder, before we go too far into the practicalities, maybe if you'd like to define resilience for us. How do you
okay,
describe it?
I'm going to show you a picture, and it's a question to everyone here. So if I share my screen, and I'm going to just go there. So here's is a kind of thought experiment. I'm going to invite you all to imagine that you're holding a tomato in one hand and a tennis ball in the other. Actually, I should have brought them along with me, but I just got the picture anyway. But if you can imagine that, and then what I want you to do is, just as a thought experiment is, what if? And what if you squeezed? And you can take one hand at a time. So if we squeeze the tennis ball, squeeze it in, and it kind of gives a bit, and then when you let go again, it springs back into shape. And that's how resilience is often thought of. The Latin root is resilere, which is to spring back. So you might have a knock in your life, but afterwards you spring back into shape. Now the tomato, on the other hand, if you squeeze that, what happens? You might write in the chat window what happens when you squeeze the tomato. I don't know if you're seeing anything, Mark, or you can tell
Bursting,
me.
but I've just seen, Chris.
Bursting. It's amazing. I did this on a course
Wish.
actually not
Yes.
long ago, Squish, and it's amazing how far the tomato seeds squirt out to the side. It makes a real mess. That's why I don't do it in, in here right now. But it's interesting because if you did that outside with soil underneath you, you could imagine the possibility of coming back in 10 years' time on a nice sunny day and seeing tomato plants growing around you. And that's a different story of resilience. So resilience is really about, when you have a difficult beginning, what makes a better ending more likely. And so springing back into shape is one version that's often talked about as bouncing back. And tomato seeds are incredibly resilient. They can be eaten by birds and survive through the bird's digestive system, and then find themselves planted somewhere with a little pile of manure and grow into a new tomato plant. So
I love
we
that.
might
So sometimes resilience is quite messy potentially. It's not always just a simple bounce back. So
sometimes I feel like a squashed tomato on the floor. You know, we have those moments of collapse, and some people might think, oh, that's not very resilient, but I think we need to think of a larger story, that we have our dips, but then it's looking at what helps us recover, and that you can collapse, and then there's a lovely I call it a transformative dip. I went through a transformative dip when I was a junior doctor. I went through a time where I was like a real messed up tomato, but actually something grew from that. And a great question is, what good can come from this? You know, when you're feeling like a squashed tomato, how can you plant seeds of your own recovery?
well, Chris, I'd love to come on to the how we do it, because obviously we're Action for Happiness, and the audience, I'm sure, are keen to hear the practical ideas. But I'd invite you just to sort of stop the screen share for a moment, because I also feel that you and I have an obligation here, which is to recognise the situation we're in as a global family right now. And you sometimes hear it said that, in this crisis, we're all in this together. But I've heard you say something really wise about how actually lots of us are facing very different experiences right now. So I feel that before we go into the practical solutions, it's worth sort of holding space for the fact that this is a really quite challenging time for many people, but rather differentially challenging. How do you see this current situation the world is facing?
I think that for many people it's extremely difficult, you know, really taken us to real I have kind of a zoning system where I think of the green zone is a okay level of challenge, orange zone when we're stretched, and red zone is where we're pushed into something beyond what we can normally cope with. And so many people in so many different ways are being pushed into the red zone, whether it's their own anxieties about getting ill, and also the reality of getting ill, losing loved ones, but also the economic impacts as well, losing their employment and losing contact. You know, loneliness is such a huge problem anyway.
Mm.
People I've spoken to, been on my courses, found that, you know, loneliness, just not even being able to touch anyone, not even be able to hold somebody's hand, we're really being pushed outside our normal shape. And that's why it's so important that we're having this conversation now, because uh, in teaching about resilience, I work with this idea of a story of resilience. A story of resilience has a difficult beginning, but then it's looking at what helps a better than expected outcome happen.
And
And
I
that's
think,
a direction to aim for.
yeah, thank you. I really appreciate you sort of putting this into context, because, as you said, it is more important now perhaps than ever before. So on that note, then, Chris, we'd love to hear some of your practical suggestions, and I know you wanted to share some more visual things with us. What are some of the ways we can put this into practice in terms of skills and visualizations and coping strategies?
So oh, here we go. I think I've just lost. Oh, there we go. So I was having my own little dip moment as I lost you on my computer screen, but I found you again. And somebody went on one of my courses a couple of years ago, and they told me afterwards, they said one of the most useful things they took from the course was the question, what does a story of resilience look like here? So I'm gonna just put that there. So and I call this skill storyboarding. It's just kind of having a sense of plotting out what would a story of resilience look like here. That's a question I'd love to leave you all with. This um, Heather name, and who'd been on one of my courses, she had an emergency admission to hospital. And she said that that question changed her experience, because it was like a reference point when she found herself being scared or something difficult. She could say, okay, you know, that's part one of the story. Where's it going to go from here? And so every story has a main character, and a story of resilience has some kind of difficulty, and that difficulty might be in the past, might be in the present, might be in the future, but you know that there's something challenging going on and adversity. And then what makes it a story of resilience is some kind of helping factor that heads in the direction or makes more likely the better outcome. There's no guarantee that it will all work out well, but you do something that heads that way or makes it more likely. And that's what the bounce is about. The bounce, and by the way, it's not as simple as just down and up. I wish it was in some ways, but life is much more of a roller coaster. And a term that's being used around at the moment is that we're on a corona coaster. There's up and down, but life has its ups and downs. But one of the most important questions is, when we have the downs, what helps us support the up? And the downs will always come again. It's a feature of life, but how do we find the upward direction? And that's where bounce comes in, bounce ability. And I think of these different types of bounce ability. So the tennis ball, when you push it in, it bounces back. You have a bad dose of the flu, or you feel low for a while, and then a couple of months later, you might feel back to your old self. And you might think, phew, I'm back to my old self. And that's bouncing back, recovery resilience. But there's sometimes where you don't even dip down so much. It's like you've got a natural buoyancy that keeps you afloat even in rough water. And I think of the cork floating on the waves. It's bouncing with the waves rather than being sunk by them. And that's really about adapting to situations, adaptive resilience. And we need that right now. We need to recover from the dips, but we also need to adapt to the turbulence of these difficult times. But also, like the tomato was squashed, and the seeds went out and they grew into something new and different. And another image for this is a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. Most extraordinary process. It's a process of change, including internal reorganization. And so that's transformative resilience, or bouncing forward. And then one of the things I love about what you're doing, Mark, with Action for Happiness, is you don't want to keep it all to yourself. You want to spread it far and wide. And you also want to empower people to be part of the process of spreading happiness and having a culture, developing a culture that supports happiness, where happiness is kind of seen as something, as a core value, well-being as a core value. And so with resilience too, spreading resilience is where we share it, we transmit it, we pass it on. So your question to me, Mark, was, well, how? How do we do it? And one of the things, it's about our stance inside. And so if we kind of just have this question, okay, what does a story of resilience look like here? And in any story, we need to acknowledge where we are. Just having our eyes open, our hearts open, our minds open. Um, and what I find helpful here is just self-talk. So self-talk is how I speak to myself. And when something's difficult going along, I go, so here I am. So here I am. Here's me facing this. And that's the first part of the story. Here's me facing this. And we wondered about inviting everyone here on this call to think about, well, what are you facing right now? I'm just going to jump ahead. If this was a storyboard, and we're doing a simple two-part storyboard where basically there's a kind of down, there's what happens, that's the difficult bit. And what happens next, that's our goal. We're going to be looking at what can we do with whatever we're facing that helps a better version of that happen. What would you write in the chat window? What are you facing? Just so that we get a sense of the
So for now, we're
context
asking people
faced.
to share what they're facing right now. Here's me facing this. So we're going to try and get people, if they're willing to share some of the challenges right now, first of all. And we'll come back to some of the responses to those next, shall we?
Exactly. So really, if we're doing the how is to start from where you are and to acknowledge it. And we're inviting all of you to do that. So we're in this together, like all of us on this webinar. And that also includes if you're listening to the recording as well. Think just to yourself, okay, so here's me facing, what is it you're facing? If you're on the live webinar, we'd love to hear. Sets our context, and also we can be alongside each other in facing this. We can have our sense of solidarity. I don't know what you're reading already,
Chris, I
Mark.
mean, amazing, ups and downs, loneliness, loss of husband, living in a frustrating situation, not socializing, not being able to see family. I've lost my mum. I'm missing my friends. Uncertainty and fear. Lost my partner's mother last week. Chronic pain, parenting burnout, bereavement at university, isolation with teenagers, financial worries, caring for elderly parents, dismay at political incompetence, missing family, having a family feud, conflict at work, running a small business, having hours reduced, recovering from burnout, partner's behavior, and I could go on. But I mean, thank you, folks. This is an amazingly
Yes.
powerful experience. And what I'm feeling here, I don't know if you're getting this as well, Chris, is a real sense of common humanity, really, which is that actually we are all together in this fact that life is hard, and some of these are obviously more intense than others, but suffering seems to be fairly universal part of being a human being.
And when I was hearing it, I was feeling stirred. I
Yeah.
was feeling there's a thing about resonance, if you have like one piano note you play and it's like the notes alongside it also begin to buzz a bit. And we're like that too. If one person feels, the people around them are likely to feel too. And it's a wonderful part of being a human. We feel with each other, that compassion. But also,
Chris, on that, I just saw one note. I don't know if I can find it again now, but sorry, it was a message in response to all of these amazing messages from someone who just said, I'm afraid I've lost it because so many have flown past. But
ah,
she said something along the lines of the level of sort of depth in these messages is so like breathtaking, really, because it is, as you say, it's really emotional to see the amount of real human connection, but also trauma that people are experiencing.
it's really interesting. I was in a webinar just last night and someone in the group was from China. And apparently there's a Chinese symbol for small, which is kind of like a line down and then arms out like that. And so you could do this kind of motion like there. And the Chinese character for big is like that. And I'd just like to invite all of you just to imagine that you can reach out and make contact with other people. We're not all in the same room, we're not all in the same country, we're all on the same planet. And there and it feels different from where we are, but there's common themes. I really heard loss, I really heard pain, I really heard stress, that and also heard guilt. Some people are suffering more than me. Maybe I've got it easier. We feel what we feel, and that's the starting point. But then we've got choices about how we deal with that. And it's interesting, research on resilience shows that one of the strongest predictors of good outcome is reaching out and having contact with other people. That people who have networks of support tend to do better. Now, I I interviewed somebody who was kidnapped and he was held as a hostage underground in this tiny little hole. His name's Peter Shaw, and he wrote a book about it called Hole. And it was for months he was basically in social and sensory isolation. And I asked him, I said, how did you cope? What helped you? And one of the things that he did was that he imagined people who'd been important to him in his life. And he imagined having a meeting with them where he gave them a speech. He gave them a speech kind of recounting old times with them. And what that really taught me was how important our memory and imagination are as resources. We can imagine what would a friend say if they were with me right now? We can remember people who've been important sources of support in the past. In fact, many cultures do this. They have shrines to their ancestors. They have a sense of connection with things bigger themselves. It's this motion, the Chinese character for large, reaching out, making contact. And I totally want to acknowledge how very difficult this is right now, extraordinarily difficult. We can't even hold hands and shake hands with our neighbors these days. But what we can do is focus on what we can do rather than what we can't. And so it's kind of like saying, well, okay, how does the story of resilience? Here's me facing this, whatever it is. Now we're going to go on a journey. And what I again with pictures, I work a lot with pictures. Pictures say 1,000 words, but one of the pictures I use a lot. I'm going to share my screen again. It's just this one here. It's called the spider diagram. And what I mean by this spider diagram is just acknowledging that whatever you face, there's different ways it can go. So the body of the spider is the present moment, and each leg is a different possible version of the future. And there's better ways, and there's worse ways, and in between ways. And one of the questions they teach in the Penn Resilience Program that's developed by psychologists at the University of Pennsylvania, they have this perspective check where they ask people, they say, what's the best that can happen here? What's the worst that can happen here, and also what's most likely? And Lynn, someone I worked with, was on one of my courses. She worked with children, and she'd do it with her hand like that. She'd say, "What's the best? You know, what you'd stick your thumb up at. What's the worst? What's most likely?" And I love this phrase. Active hope is about identifying what we hope for and making that more likely. So when we say what's the best, what's the worst, what's most likely, don't stop there. Then say, how can we make the best or better options more likely, the worst or less favorable options less likely? And that's the second part of the story. That's where we're, and I think of it as like a double spider. There's, even if we find ourselves on a difficult leg, as we are in so many ways, you know, it's not just the pandemic, there's also climate change. There's also a massive recession that's either here or is heading our way. Whatever we face, how do we find the best version of that? And that's active hope, where we, whatever we face, we look for what's the version of that that we hope for, and how do we play a part in making that more likely? How's this
That's great.
sounding to you, Mark, so
Yeah, it sounds
far?
fantastic, and I like you love that phrase, active hope. I'm feeling well. I love that introduction you gave about focus on what you can do rather than what you can't do, which feels to me is the most fundamental resilience skill, but quite easy to say and harder to do. But I wonder if you could help us all, having all shared. Here's me facing this, what we're struggling with right now. Maybe you could invite us to find a way to articulate our own source of hope in response to those things. Is there some way we could ask the audience to do that?
Okay, so I'm going to share another image. And I went to a lecture over 30 years ago when I was a medical student in London. And this pioneer of the holistic approach, Professor Patrick Pietroni, one thing he did, he drew an image on the, let me just see if I can find it here. Okay, so, and anyone who's done training with me or read my book, Seven Ways to Build Resilience, they'll know about this image because let me see, I just need to share again. So share to, okay, so here's the image. And so when you're facing the difficulty, what I'm going to ask you to do is just picture in your mind someone rowing along in a little boat. And there's times in life where we're rowing along merrily, things are going fine. And there's times in life where we crash. It's part of life, you know, we have crash moments. And one approach to the crashes is to find somebody who knows about the rock. And when I was a medical doctor, that people would come and see me, and one of my first questions would be, what's the problem? And it was a problem focused approach, very helpful. And what Professor Patrick Petroni said, he said the rock's just half the story, because there's also the water level. And when your water levels push down, you're more likely to crash into rocks. And so having a low water level is like having a lower level of resilience. The water level here is a way of thinking about resilience. And uh, also what's in this example is the idea that resilience isn't fixed. We have good days and not so good days. You can encounter the same problem 3 times in a month and one time deal with it much better than the other 2 times. And so a sentence starter I have is, I tend to cope less well when. Acknowledge the times when resilience is difficult. And we'll all have those, but also building resilience is about finding the arrows that go the other way. And so you can ask a question, have a sentence that begins, I tend to cope better when. And you might think for yourself, when I faced difficult things in the past, when have been the times that I've coped better? And each upward arrow is something that helps you cope better. I don't know, how is this sounding to you, Mark? What's coming to you as upward and downward arrows for yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I mean, it's quite topical because I actually had a really difficult day today. Actually, some challenges, some things going on at home, some difficult interactions in context of work around challenging issues and safeguarding, and there's a general overload of complicated things that have come up today. And I recognise that I cope less well when I feel like there's more to do than I can possibly cope with. I felt I had family needs, I had team needs, I had people in the community that were expecting responses. I sort of felt like I might be letting people down, and it got to the point where each of those individually was fine, but together they were really, really overwhelming. So I'm not sure I discovered active hope necessarily, but I think one thing I did ask myself was, how could I reframe this? Because I was actually cycling at one point today between meetings and felt really, really overburdened. But then I remember stopping and thinking, but do I have a choice here about how I'm framing this? So one message was, I'm really struggling today. And I managed to at least partially shift that to a story of, actually, I'm so lucky that I'm able to have a job I care about, a family to go home to, this inspiring colleagues to work with. And although today's difficult, this is all stuff that I'm really grateful for. And actually, I know I'll cope better if I take a breath, put it into context, try and get through the day, get some sleep, see my loved ones. And so I'm not saying it's perfectly solved it, but what you're sharing today really chimes with my own experience of quite a difficult day, actually.
And what you're doing is you're drawing on the upward arrow of gratitude. Research proven, it's an evidence-based intervention that when we can draw on what we value, what I think of it as resourcing, we resource ourselves. And one simple way, and we can try it now, in any week, there are better moments and worse moments. And you might think, I'm having one of my worst moments of the week just now. But for a moment, I'm just going to see if I can remember one of the better times. Okay, so I'm here now. Here's me facing this, and it's not about avoidance. It's about resourcing. How do I draw in the resources? You might think of your resilience batteries or resilience water levels. The way I use this, as I say to myself, I say, Chris, how's my water level doing? And if it's getting low, then I think, okay, what can I do that would be an upward arrow right now? And so a really great one is remember, I'm going to invite all of you to do this right now. Just I search my memory banks. I put my hands on my head like this and I go, okay, searching my memory banks, see if I can find a better memory. One of my favorite moments in the last week is, I'm going to invite people just to write that in the chat window. We've heard what you're facing, and very important, that's kind of like the starting point of the story. Here's me facing. And in this short two-part story, we're saying, here's me facing, and what helps is.
And Chris,
And
I'm already motivated to share some of what's coming up.
I'd love to
Family
hear.
dinners, listening to birds, walking in the woods, cuddling my cat, my son, my grandson, working from home, being at the seafront, laughing with colleagues, giving my son a birthday present, walking my dog, having giggles with a friend, making soap, walking in the sun, laughter, sparklers in the garden, playing my cello, walking up to a waterfall, having a great lesson, family dinners, acknowledgement from friends, hugging my son, painting, cooking, running outdoors, being in the sunshine, realizing it's okay to be vulnerable and not perfect, book club, art making, sea and sunshine, mindfulness, cake baking, music, wild nature, family pictures, bike rides, resting, photography, and I could go on. But what a
And,
lovely,
and
I feel that. I really
and
feel that.
just to have that recording, Mark, of just you speaking for the last half or 1 minute, that if we can have like that as like a little playlist for ourselves, we can a gratitude exercise I really enjoy is just to think of the words I love. I love ... and then talk for 1 minute. I haven't set a timer. You can do this in groups, or you can write at the top of the page, I love ... And what I heard was waterfalls and cellos and dogs, and like lovely. And what it does is it actually has an impact. And Barbara Friedrichsen, the positive psychologist, she talked about the undoing effect of positive emotions. Now, I'm also aware of the voice that might say something like, well, that's not going to do much. When you've just lost someone close to you, thinking of waterfalls and cellos and dogs isn't going to cut it. And what I want to acknowledge is that nothing is ever just by itself. You can put a little box around one thing and look at it in isolation and think that's not going to do much. But the value of this practice is to see each moment as just a step along the way. And we're looking at what can we do that turns towards recovery. May not be the whole journey, but it's a step. As a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a step. And so what I do in training, I'm just going to go back to this image and you can see the image okay? Thumbs up, Mark, is that okay? So we can develop this model. So what I do is then I look at different, well, first of all, just this image. If we have enough upward arrows, it has a buffering effect. And just to kind of remember that okay, we might start off small, but we build it up. Upward arrows have a buffering effect, but part of resilience training is becoming an upward arrowologist. It's like you really take seriously your study of the skill of developing upward arrows. And I have a toolkit, I call it the Self-Help SSRI toolkit, where those letters SSRI stand for strategies, strengths, resources, and insights. And it's interesting that those letters are commonly associated with antidepressants. And when I worked in mental health and I prescribed antidepressants, as I would sometimes, and very helpful for some people, I'd always ask people, would you like your tablets to be more effective? And people always said yes. And I said, well, the key is don't let the tablets do all the work. And what we're looking at here is what I think of as the natural antidepressant, the behavioral antidepressant. It's recognizing that actions you take and choices you make can have an antidepressant effect. And research has shown this very clearly. And so these strategies, strengths, resources, and insights, that's your resilience toolkit. And if you want to develop this, it's worth thinking of a difficult time you've got through and ask yourself, what helped you do that? What other strategies you used? A strategy is something you do. What are the strengths you drew upon? What are the resources you turn to? I think of resources as what you turn to outside yourself. I mean, you can have inner resources as well, but particularly, Mark, you're a resource. You've set up, developed, direct a resource, Action for Happiness. Books a resource, online courses, but also friends and pets and trees and special places in nature that we might go, but also insights. An insight is a guiding idea. It's like when I think this way, I'm more likely to. And that's really what a lot of resilience training is about, is really about how we develop these. Um, I wrote a book, 7 Ways to Build Resilience, where I collected together my favorite resilience tools. I teach resilience. I've got a free online course called Resilience Tools for Free in a time of coronavirus crisis. There's a website, resiliencetraining.net. And I also work at collegeofwellbeing.com. This is my work, really. It's looking at...
Chris, on that note, just to let everyone know so they don't need to worry about getting those links now, we'll send everyone who's joined this webinar links to those great resources, which I fully encourage you to check out. And such gratitude to you, Chris, for sharing so much of that wisdom for free to help people. It really is amazing. So we'll send those around in the follow-up email tomorrow. Chris, I'm conscious of time and there's lots of great questions coming in. I would love us to turn, before we come to the questions, though, just to this question of looking outwards. You said at the start something really powerful about not just personal resilience, but resilience for each other. And just a lovely example, Kurt shared earlier on the chat, and I made a note of this. He said, I shared my cancer diagnosis and the journey through chemo with my Facebook community, and the outpouring of love, prayers, well wishes, and support changed my life and helped me along the way. And you've talked about this togetherness and this need for community. Maybe you could say a little bit before we come to the other questions about how resilience is not just an individual endeavor, it connects us in some way.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mark. So I work with what I call the me, you, and us model of resilience. So me is about self-care. What can I do myself? You is about helping others. It might be a family member, or it might be professionally. You might help a coaching client or a healthcare patient or a student or a colleague at work. But it might also be your neighbor. It might be a friend. But also there's a very important us side of resilience, particularly at the moment when we're having shared threats, shared adversities, and that it's really looking at the kind of structural response for resilience. How do we develop a more resilient community? How do we develop a more resilient society? And part of it is actually about developing a more compassionate society where we cultivate trust, solidarity, caring for each other. And I must say, I've been so struck, inspired, and impressed by the upswell of community feeling that's been around with the pandemic. And I've seen lots of examples. I've seen it in my village. We've set up a little village support group. I've got to know neighbours that I've never met before. But also, there's something here also about when we contribute to collective well-being, it deepens our sense of meaningfulness and purpose in life. It gives us a sense that it is worth showing up. And that's actually very important for our mental health as well. So, actually contributing towards cultural collective resilience it's not like an either or between me and us. Actually, when you act for us, it's good for me, but also by understanding how to help the me side, you can then share that with others in a way that helps us. So I think this is so important
Thank
in
you,
this
Chris.
time.
That's really powerful. Let's come to some of these questions, and I'm going to be a little bit difficult here and start with a really hard one. But I think you just touched on a moment ago how these lovely walks in nature are fabulous, but of course some people are facing really difficult situations. You talked about that sort of looking for better outcomes. Kate's just said, "Are there better outcomes when you know you're going to die of cancer? That's my reality." So, Kate, thank you first of all for sharing that, and I'm so sorry to hear about your situation. Chris, it's a really good question. When your life is on the line, how can you find a story of resilience?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for sharing that and feel us as a community alongside you. And what I'd say is my touchstone with resilience is the spider diagram. Is this: if you're dying of cancer, there's different ways that can go. There's different versions of how the story of dying from cancer can go. And I've worked with people living with cancer and have also learned a lot from them too, about how we approach death. There are ways of preparing ourselves for an end. There are ways of, even in the moment, recognizing, well, here's me facing this. What particularly about this do I find most difficult? You know, it's frightening. Yes, it might also be pain. It might also be that I've got some things which feel unfinished. And it's looking at, well, what are the things I can do? And I think of them as choice points. So choice points is I could go this way or that way. And I also want to recognize that some of it feels out of our choice. And this is where there's an important distinction between control and influence. We don't control what happens, but we can shape it sometimes. We can steer it a bit more this way rather than that way. And it might even be, for example, when, nearly 40 years ago now, when I got involved in that research as a student, getting people to plunge their hands in buckets of ice water. It was horribly cold. But what people found was one of the things that made the difference was where they placed their attention. If they had their attention on their hand in the ice, it tended to hurt more than if they found something else to focus their attention on. And so in terms of research, one of the bits of research shows that the people who tend to be happiest are positive reminiscers, people who can look back in time and focus on the bits of their experience that they've really valued, that they've really appreciated. And I think that I've kind of thought about this as an exercise. You asked me the other day, Mark, about scenario planning. Is it helpful to think of a most difficult situation we can find ourselves in, and then to ask ourselves, well, how what would a story of resilience look like there? And I think sometimes it is helpful. One of the things I thought of is, what would I do if I had a diagnosis of terminal cancer? And I'd be shocked, when it hurts, say ouch. I would I don't know how I would feel, but I'd probably be like that tomato on the floor. And also there might come a time where I can then pick myself up a bit and look at, well, what are the choices available to me? I'd be really interested in the person who's asked that question. Are there choices you've made that have helped have a better day rather than a worse day? And it's a bit like Groundhog Day, that sense of each day is a new beginning. And it's just kind of, the challenge is there anything I can do in this day that will lead this day to be a better version rather than a worse version? And that's even though dot dot dot. And there's always going to be an even though. And in the summer, I worked for 6 weeks. We had a webinar every week with mental health professionals in Lebanon. And after our sixth webinar, which ran from the end of June, it was up to August, on the 4th of August, there was this massive explosion in Beirut. And people in my group were influenced. One of the people, she lost her home, Dana. And I interviewed her afterwards and I said, like, this sounds like the most awful thing that can happen. And when she came back to the wreck of her home, she saw bodies of her neighbors and friends lying on the street, really ghastly. But she said she'd remembered what we'd done in the resilience course. It took a little while. She was so shocked at first, but when she kind of was able to gather herself a bit, she remembered there were things that helped have a better day rather than a worse day. One of them was finding some sense of routine in a day, finding some, think of them as safe harbor points, things that you can retreat into. I don't know how this is sounding, Mark. It might feel like it's nowhere near enough, but the important thing here is the direction we move in. We may never get as far as we want to go, but even if we get a tenth of the way there, that might be a better day than a worse day, or worse than it might have been otherwise.
Chris, I'll tell you how I'm feeling. I'm feeling very moved and emotional, partly by what you've said, which I think is incredibly wise and helpful, but also while you've been speaking, the amount of love and outpouring of compassion and solidarity towards Kate, who bravely shared that with us all and which you've responded to, has been amazing. So thank you, everyone. Kate, if you are still here and not watching the chat, I would encourage you to just see that amazing outpouring of just friendship and solidarity and compassion. And people are showing a lot of gratitude for your wisdom, Chris, as well, and wishing this webinar could go on for longer, but we only have about 12 minutes left, and there's plenty of other questions I'd love to ask you. So Kathleen has asked an interesting point, which I think is related, and says, love to hear your thoughts on this question. Do we become more or less resilient as we tell our story repeatedly about our setbacks and difficulties? And I feel a bit torn on this one sometimes. There's this sense that being vulnerable and sharing our sort of warts and all reality is such a powerful tool. Brené Brown talks very, very movingly about the power of vulnerability. And yet, if we get stuck in our sort of narrative of failure and pain and struggle, we can sometimes perhaps miss the opportunity to see the story of resilience. How do you see that sort of, you know, whether sharing the darkness is helpful or not helpful, or indeed both?
Yes, when I'm with people, my first step is to listen. I want to understand. I want to hear what's going on. Particularly, here's me facing. I want to hear what they're facing. And if I didn't do that, I wouldn't really be in much of a position to help, because I think resilience needs to be customized to the context. And it's not just one thing for everybody. It's like saying, okay, from this starting point, then what's going to help? But I think the thing about this two-part story, and in my storyboarding frameworks, we also have a six-part version, is that you don't just get stuck on the problem. In addictions recovery groups, they say, look, don't stare. When it's good to acknowledge problems. It's a bit like if you're overdrawn, it's good to look at your bank statement, but you don't want to be walking around with your bank statement in front of you all the time. It's like once you've got the message, then the second part of the story kicks in, which is, and what helps me is. And so in working with people, I want to hear enough of the first part of the story to really understand and to also feel with. And there is something about when we describe, if it's only just like a intellectual reporting, it only goes so far. Sometimes we actually feel the pain as part of coming to terms with a different reality, and particularly with loss, particularly like the kind of recalibration that's required. Otherwise, we end up being stuck on an old version of history, that we kind of are still making plans as if things weren't as bad as they really are. We need
Mm.
to acknowledge, and I think of it, there's a kind of digestion process where we take in at a head level and then digest at a heart level. And once we've done that, once we've really kind of got a sense of, okay, here's me facing, then there's a journey about developing a response. And it may not come straight away, and we may feel like we're unprepared and ill-equipped and underpowered. But I like adventure stories where in the first chapters, the main characters nearly always feel underpowered. Frodo, not very tall, Harry Potter locked in the cupboard under the stairs. And what makes those stories is a journey of seeking support, searching out allies, searching out insights and implements and the things that will help. And I love that adventure storyline for resilience. And sometimes I say to myself when I'm really struggling, I say, Chris, this is my adventure. Okay, it's difficult now. Another saying I have sometimes, what you talked about as the reframe, I say, Chris, this is my advanced resilience training.
Mhm.
It's really difficult just now, but my challenge is to seek out and practice my resilience tools. And if the tools I've got aren't up to the task, then I need to go on a quest of seeking some out. I need to interview other people who've perhaps been in a similar situation. I need to search out self-help books and inspiring talks on the internet. And then what happens in that journey is I find other people who have similar concerns, and we face that quest together, and you build a kind of a merry gang. And this is what happens in all these great adventure stories. They don't tend to be solo missions. They tend to be group journeys of finding support, facing this together. And very often it's not just for their own personal advancement, it's for a bigger meaning, it's for a bigger story, a bigger purpose. And that's really
I
what I
love
think
I love this because
feeds resilience.
that sense of a grand narrative is a really powerful way of reframing, and I find that very inspiring. Just to answer another question directly that's come up a lot here. Yes, people are asking, will the video from this be available? Yes, absolutely. Everyone who's been part of this will get a chance via an email tomorrow to access the video from the event and the chat file. You'll be able to see all these lovely, helpful comments and people that have shared, as well as the links to the programs that you mentioned, Chris. I want to do a couple of quick fire ones that have come up, see if we can get really fairly quick responses to these so we can squeeze them in. So Owen has asked, what's the difference between genuine resilience and simply thinking happy thoughts?
So I think one really good question is, what's the effect of what I do? And thinking happy thoughts can be helpful. And I love the idea of what's called hunt the good stuff. Hunt the good stuff. It might be looking at your last week favorite moment, might be looking around you right now for something that you value, you appreciate, you love. That's part of how we resource ourselves. But also it's a bit like playing tennis. If you just have one stroke for every time the ball comes your way, you might hit 1 in 6. And we need to have a range of different tools. And so I'd say happy thoughts are on the list, but also sometimes happy thoughts can actually lead me the wrong way. And for example, when I'm facing a genuine concern, here's me when I had my car crash. I was horrified, I was shocked, I was destroyed in lots of ways because I spent years and years thinking I wanted to be a doctor and training to be a doctor. And I just had come to the point where I thought, this is the end of the line for medicine for me. And I could have spray painted on a good picture and seen the best of it, but that wouldn't help me make what felt like a life preserving decision to leave.
Mm.
And so it's the same with giving up smoking. I used to smoke, and I think it's giving up smoking is one of the best things I've ever done. But I didn't give up smoking by having happy thoughts about my smoking. I gave up my smoking by having unhappy thoughts about my smoking. There's a lovely term, inspirational dissatisfaction.
Oh,
When we're
that's great.
so
Yeah.
dissatisfied by something, it inspires us to make a change. And in addictions recovery, that's what people talk about as hitting rock bottom. It's like when the pain of what you're doing is so um, compelling that it leads you to change.
That's very wise, Chris, and a really helpful distinction. Another theme that's coming up a lot is children. So Donna has said, any ideas on how to help children build resilience? I work with children and they are so resilient, which always inspires me. But many of them are feeling anxious about COVID and have been unsettled by all the changes, not seeing loved ones, school procedures, and so on. I mean, it feels to me that what you're sharing here are the fundamental life skills that we should all learn early in life, and sadly often don't. What are your thoughts on helping build resilience in kids?
I'd say for adults or children, we feel what we feel, we face what we face, and there are things that help. Research has shown very clearly where they've done resilience training courses for school age children that it reduces their risk of anxiety and depression. Same is true with adults as well, that this is an evidence-based intervention. And I'm it's something I've really believe in at a time when there's spiraling levels of prescribing of antidepressants, and they have their role, they have their place. But also, I think of it as like that natural antidepressant, the self-help antidepressant, the self-help SSRI of strategies, strengths, resources, and insights. We all need those, whether we're adults or children. And I'd say the sooner we start, the better. But also, it's never too late as well.
Yes, I very much agree with that. Thank you, Chris. I think we've got time for one more final one before I might turn back to you for a final word, Chris. This has been so powerful, and there's so much, again, appreciation for what you've been sharing. Someone anonymously has said, could Chris just say something about self-compassion? You know, we've had Kristen Neff involved in these webinars before, and it feels closely related to what we've been talking about. How do you see self-compassion in relation to resilience?
I love self-compassion. I love, I see it as a very important upward arrow. And I say this because I recognize in myself a voice that the writer Starhawk, she called it the self-hater. And it's a term I sometimes use is the crap channel. The crap channel is like a radio program that blares out a constant running commentary about how what a mess you've made of things, blah, blah, blah. And I've got an active one of those, but I've also come a long way encountering it, and self-compassion is one of the ways that I've done that. And so there's a lot of interest in mindfulness, and I love the word kindfulness. So mindfulness and kindfulness, people who are kind are often much better at being kind to others than they are at being kind to themselves. And so what I'd say is with kindfulness, do it the me, you and us way. So you start with yourself. You say, how can I be kind to myself? When you're kinder to yourself, you're actually more likely to be kinder to others too. It's when you're, I know for myself, it's when I'm in a unkind place with myself that I'm more likely to be tense and irritable with other people too. So, okay, so how can I be kind to myself? And you can even imagine, like, what would a good friend say to me right now? And also there's a whole body of work around mindful self-compassion, Christine Neff's work, which again is an evidence-based approach to improving well-being. This is a strong upward arrow, and thank you for mentioning it.
Chris, I've been so moved by this evening. I feel like I've developed my own story of resilience. I was about to share a comment I'd seen on the chat, but as always with these chats, it flies past so quickly because there's so many people saying things. It was someone else showing great appreciation for what you said this evening. I think it was on the lines of the best well-being talk that they'd ever heard. So thank you on behalf of everyone here for being with us this evening. Before we close and we're out of time, I just wanted to invite you to share any final thought with the audience to leave us with this evening.
Yes, I think it's this, it's whatever you face, think of this. and think, okay, what's the best that can happen here? What's the worst? What's most likely? But also, how can I make a better version of this more likely? And the question that guides me is, what would a story of resilience look like here? Stories of resilience have difficult beginnings. They often have difficult middles too. When things are really ghastly, I call it a chapter 7 moment. You know, I'm having a chapter 7 moment. Usually by chapter 7, things have gone really appallingly badly. But then it's also like saying, well, okay, there's what happens and there's what happens next. And what happens next is still in front of us. It's still something that we can influence. And the challenge of resilience is to play a part in the story that helps a better outcome become more likely or move in that direction.
What a lovely way to finish. Chris, thank you so much for your time this evening, for all of the work you're doing, for sharing so much insight with us. Thank you to everyone who's been part of this event as well. It's been amazing to have over 2,000 people live throughout this. All the wonderful things you shared, both about what's going on for you, but also your stories of hope and resilience in response to that. Chris, we'll share your resources tomorrow. Thank you so much for putting so much of this wisdom for free out in the public domain. We'll do whatever we can to help promote that. So thank you for being with us. It's been a real pleasure.
Pleasure. Pleasure for me too. Thank you everyone for being part of this, whether you're listening to the recording or part of the live event.